Good evening. Thanks for joining us for this author's chat with Paul McCue on his recent book, Lillian. We're going to go into all of that shortly, but just a quick bit about Barnthorne Publishing. We're a fairly new publisher, been going for a couple of years now, specialised mainly in military history, but we do have kind of other genre stuff as well. So if you're interested in publishing with us and or indeed buying from us, please look at our website and get in touch. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Paul to introduce yourself, Paul. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Name's Paul McCue, and I live in Hampshire at the moment. Born and grew up in Yorkshire, so still speak the language. And for the last 30 odd years, I've been a military historian of sorts, very much an amateur, but started out with local history and military history and gone on from there. I don't do as much writing as I do research, and I have to say I'm a slightly reluctant writer. It's the research that I provide. In terms of career, I haven't been in the military at all, although for 11 years I was the armed forces advisor to one of the London boroughs, mostly reserve units. But otherwise, the level I got to was in the Air Cadets in Guildford, and I am still a member of the committee in the Air Cadets at Guildford, which is the second best ATC squadron in the country. I'll just throw that in. So I'm certainly the longest serving member of that squadron. Um, but that's it. Otherwise, I spent 30 odd years in the public sector, in the local government service, and then I went to the private sector before retiring some 7 years ago as managing director of a London leisure and culture company. So that's really my background, and this is my, I think, sixth book. I've also edited one or two others, and I've moved on to really a specialization of SOE and other special operations and intelligence services, special forces in the Second World War.
Brilliant. And you kind of started my next question for me. So, as you say, it's not your first book, but where did the journey begin for you? What kind of how did you get into writing, like researching, etc.?
Yeah. I started in my teens because I used to live near an aerodrome, which had been a wartime airfield, Dunsfold. And it post-war became quite famous for Hawker Aircraft Limited, Hawker Siddeley, the Hunter and the Harrier. So as I was a lad growing up in Surrey, we moved down there from Yorkshire. I was very much interested in that side of it and the aviation side and the military aviation side. And even when I was about 15, I did some early research at what was then the Public Record Office in Chancery Lane. And it was some years later that I rediscovered that, and I started out down the path of writing the history of that aerodrome, and that was my first book, Dunsfold. And each book has actually led on to another book, apart from one difference, which was a First World War title. But again, that was local history in London. But otherwise, there's been a connection between the books. So from Dunsfold came an SAS operation, Operation Bullbasket. From that came a book, a biography on Amédée Mengar, who was a French section agent, like Lillian. And so usually there's that thread going through them.
Yeah, definitely. So this book, the subject is Lilian Rolfe. So for those that don't know her, not aware of her, give us a bit of an introduction to Lillian.
She was the sort of young woman in her later 20s with a bit more of a worldly air, I would say. She'd been born and grew up in Paris and had then moved to South America. I can say a little bit more about that later on. But she was quite an artistic and sensitive soul with somewhat fragile health as well. And I would say that of all the sort of female secret agents, she was probably one of the least suited in terms of looking at her. And yet, when she went to the field, she did very, very well.
Yeah, as we'll find out in due course. Um, so I guess how did the idea for this book come about? What led you to Lillian as such?
Yeah. Well, it's all down to the family. And it wasn't my idea, really. The Rolfe family, I know several of them. There are different branches in the UK and in Australia. And in particular, in Australia, Margaret Rolfe and her husband, the late Professor Barry Rolfe, had done a lot of early research and had brought together quite a bit of information, traced another branch of the family because Lillian had a half brother and sister, which one side of the family had not really known about. And they had done this research. Professor Rolfe then died, and Margaret and her UK-based relatives were very keen for somebody to take it on and develop it. And I did resist for a few years. They kept on at me quite gently and nicely. And in the end, I said yes. And I've enjoyed doing it. I'm glad it's over because I've got lots of other things to do. But yeah, I think the story needed telling, and I hope it's an adequate tribute to Lillian.
Yeah, definitely. But you're going to need a retirement from retirement, I think, at some point. Um,
Yes,
so the book is very much in chronological order in terms of its approach. So do you want to kind of just outline the key kind of sections of the book in that sense?
yeah. Um, First element really is her pre-service life, and that's quite interesting in terms of the fact it was in France and then in Brazil. So she didn't really have a UK-based background at all. And she then, when she volunteered to come to Britain and join the fight against the Nazis, she came in quite an interesting sea journey. So she first of all went from Rio de Janeiro up to New York, and then in the book I've covered her journey particularly from New York across to the UK because it involved one of the largest U-boat battles of the war. And I don't think that's really come out in her history before. So there's that interesting element coming to Britain. She decides to join the WAAF, and she does her training, basic training, and then does radio operator training. And it flows on from that with her perfect knowledge of French and her radio operator training, I think she must have seen a request for volunteers, or she would have been recommended by someone, and she then went for French section of SOE. So that's then the SOE element and the service when her training and then her delivery into France. And then, of course, there's a very tragic element of her capture, um, concentration camp, deportation to Germany, etc. I do cover new elements because she was one of three young women who met the same fate and who were together in prison and in concentration camp, both in Paris and in Germany. And they went on the same work parties as well. And the other two were Denise Bloch, who is not very well known, but Violette Sabo was the third. And so part of writing Lillian's book has always been that the great heroine that Violette is, and I really do consider Violette Sabo to have been one of the great heroines of SOE. Lillian was always in her shadow, and I think it comes out in the book what a strong character and what a different character Violette was. But hopefully, I've been able to, through my research, throw in some more information about Violette's captivity because it was exactly the same. And so that's another element. I then go on to the war crime trials. Then I cover the memorialization and where Lillian is remembered around the world.
And I guess you touched on it to start with to go back. So I mean, was it fairly common for people to have undertaken that journey from Brazil to the UK? It must be quite niche kind of circumstances.
There was a whole group of people from the South American countries and who came to Britain. So there were British expats. There were people from other nations who pitched up in South America. So there was quite a group of Poles and some Dutch. But there were hundreds of people of British background who, as the South American countries turned more towards the Allies rather than being neutral or in occasion pro Germany and Italy, and even pro-Japan. Um, as the tide of war turned and the attitudes changed in South America, a scheme was set up to bring volunteers from South America. And oddly enough, I went to Argentina last year, and that's where the ship that Lillian took from Rio de Janeiro, it started from Buenos Aires. And in Buenos Aires, there is still a Fleet Air Arm veteran who is, I think, 106 this year, Ronnie Scott, and he was on the same ship as Lillian, and he's still with us.
Blimey. Some story.
Yeah.
Um, so when Lillian obviously she's arrived in the UK, and as you say, she must have seen a poster or something, and that led her to the WAAF. Um, what was her role within the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and what kind of training would she have received?
Yeah, she did her basic training down at RAF Innsworth, which was a ground station, not an airfield, down in Gloucestershire. Still a military base. It's a rapid reaction NATO armored force base. She then showed capability as a radio operator. So she went to first RAF Bicester, which was an active station with Blenheims at the time. She was I think, the very first group of young women who were trained there on radio operating. And indeed, fairly quickly, they went off up to Blackpool, where a lot of WASs were trained. Um, so that was her WAF background. So she was a very capable radio operator.
Yeah, and then so subsequently, then she's how did she fall into kind of SOE's arms as such?
Well, it's hard to say for sure because there's nothing left in terms of the family records, and quite unusually, she has no personal file in the SOE records at the National Archives. So I've had to do all this from other sources, and you have to look at other agents' files and pick up what was happening around her. So that was a drawback. So it doesn't we don't actually have any direct records of why she applied, but I think the guiding um, feeling for her would have been a love of France and a loyalty to France because she was born in Paris in 1914 and until around 1934, late teens, that sort of age, um, she went to Brazil. So I think it's that love of Paris and love of France which drove her. Clearly, she spoke French like a native, was very familiar with French customs, been educated in Paris, and I think that's what it was. And she was a twin. I should say that her sister Helen went through the same sort of educational background, um, and later served in the Foreign Office postings.
And I guess, as you say, Lillian's background, her life up until that point would have made her quite desirable for SOE. When it came to interview her, etc.
Yeah, we know that she had to join the Fanny, as I think you know, if you're going to serve overseas and if you're possibly going to carry a weapon, you couldn't do that in the military if you were a woman. So the way of getting around that was to join the Fanny. So there are one or two Fanny records. So we know um, when she was interviewed, and we therefore know that it looks like one particular SOE officer interviewed her because of the correspondence between SOE and Fanny. Um, and she was clearly well thought of. She was articulate. She was decently educated. She was very presentable. And you can see from the cover of the book, she was quite a striking looking woman,
Mm.
which wasn't always a good thing. She was going to be a secret agent. You didn't really want to turn German soldiers' heads as you walked past, but she was on the side of the more attractive women agents, I think.
Definitely. And just, I guess, for the record, for those that wouldn't be aware, you're referring to the Fannies being the first aid nursing yeomanry, and obviously they still exist today, and they still operate outside of the armed forces, as you say. It's this kind of niche arrangement that they're in.
That's right. They're used in civil emergencies. They do a lot of communications work when needed. They are, I would say, semi-military. They have very military uniform in terms of their day-to-day uniform. Their smart uniform is very much similar to what it was during the Second World War, and they revere the memories of in particular, the Fannies who served in SOE during the war. And indeed, Lillian is covered on a plaque outside the Fannies Church, which is in Knightsbridge.
Hmm. And I know this next question is a talk in itself, and I know we're in very good company. I recognise a lot of the names in the live audience this evening. But for those that may not be aware, can you give us a bit of an introduction to SOE Special Operations Executive?
Yeah, formed in July 1940, it came under the Ministry of Economic Warfare. Churchill was very much behind its formation, and he wanted it res responsible to a minister away from the War Office. So it was responsible to a minister called Selwyn Jepson. It was a coalition government, and he was a Labour minister, so he wasn't actually any great friend of Churchill's. They didn't like each other. But anyway, uh, Churchill had to give some positions to Labour politicians because it was a coalition government, and Jepson got it. And it was to conduct sabotage and subversion in enemy occupied territory, apart from where we agreed demarcation lines with the Americans and the Russians. So, for instance, in the Baltic states, we did very, very little because that was a Soviet, I should say Soviet rather than Russians. It was a Soviet sphere of influence, and we didn't do a great deal in China because that was an American sphere of influence. So the first emphasis of SOE, as Churchill gave the famous order, was to set Europe ablaze. It wasn't just Europe; it was global. So there was SOE elements in India, in what was then Palestine, now Israel, in Singapore, and then in Australia. So right the way across the globe. But the first concentration was on occupied Europe.
And indeed, perhaps one of the largest segments of SOE was that in France, F section. There were obviously other French sections, as you can explain in a second. And I guess also, how does Lillian fit into, that kind of organization? What was her kind of intended role to be, etc.?
Um, yes, the main, I think I tried to sum it up, the difference between the intelligence service, SIS, MI6, and SOE as hush hush versus bang bang. And this is one of the reasons why there was tension between the two services during the war, because MI6 didn't like SOE coming onto the scene. They were going to undertake this subversion and sabotage, which was going to be noisier than MI6 going about their job as quietly as possible. So that's where the hush hush versus bang bang comes in. And so SOE agents who were put into occupied Europe were to organize where necessary, but then train and supply resistance forces. So that was the main role. And as you say, France was one of the biggest targets. Yugoslavia was actually very well supplied as well and had a lot of British people sent there. But that was the idea. A lot of circuits that were organised in France, and as you say, there were different elements of SOE operating in France, but a lot of the circuits um, had not an immediate role of sabotage because it was known that there would be reprisals against the civilian population. So only if it was considered an extremely important target would sabotage be done before D-Day. So a lot of the SOE circuits, not all of them, and there was sabotage and subversion well before D-Day, but a lot of them were concentrating their efforts on an uprising as the invasion started. And then they would be responsible for attacking German units, compromising communications, railways, telecommunications, etc.
Indeed, yeah. So we're at a point in the narrative now where Lillian has signed up for SOE. She's probably gaining a sense of what she's signed up for, but she's not quite ready to go out into the field yet. She needs to go through a series of training regimes. So would you like to talk a bit more about that? What her training would have been like?
Yeah, and I think the first thing to mention is that Lillian's training from start to finish, from when she started and when she went into France, was just 16 weeks. So for somebody with very, very little short military background in the WAAF as a radio operator, no special operations or intelligence background, or very, very little. I think she had been responsible for reporting on Axis shipping in Rio de Janeiro harbor at one point, but she didn't really have this sort of background, and it was only 16 weeks of training. And she started out at STS 7, which was the Students' Assessment Board for SOE, just outside Cranley in Surrey. And she did okay there. That only took about 4 days. She was then sent up to Scotland, and although she went to one of the paramilitary training schools, it was a very much shortened course. She only spent a fortnight in Scotland, and most of that was preliminary radio training. So at that time, where she went, which was SDS 22, Rupana Lodge, it was an overflow element for the training school in Oxfordshire. So when the place became available, she then came back down to STS 52 at Tame Park, and she completed her radio operator training there. And then there is no evidence that she went on to a finishing school at Bewley, which would have been the norm. And the fact that she only was in training for 16 weeks suggests that she didn't. And that was really quite a risk because she hadn't been in France since the early 1930s. And so she wasn't aware of wartime conditions in France. And that's what Bewley would have trained her in. They would have trained her to recognize the enemy formations and given her the confidence of dealing with day-to-day France under German occupation. So she didn't do that.
And I guess in context, this period of training, this is early 44 that's happening, or
Uh, she joined SOE late 43, December 43. I think she volunteered in November and started right at the end of 1943.
yeah. So I guess in the run up to D-Day and that heightened kind of operations ahead of then, obviously as we know, at time to time SOE have had to flex the training regime to deal with the demand in the field, and ultimately they needed bums on seats as such, and that might have been the case with such a quick training, shortened training period.
Yeah, yeah, and and it certainly was the case that radio operators in particular were very much in demand in France, and there'd been a series of disasters with circuits in summer of 1943, and it was a very, very dangerous responsibility being a radio operator because the Germans were quite adept at direction finding.
Yeah, indeed. So I guess she's deployed to Nazi occupied France in April 44, prior to D-Day, as we've mentioned. So talk us through that. How does she get to France? You know, what's her kind of experience in France up to the point of capture?
Yeah. Um, she was sent to parachute school in England up at STS 51 in Cheshire, but she dropped out after her. She started well on the ground training at the school, and then there was some undisclosed specific reason as to why she wasn't able to continue. Whether she had an injury or whether it was her health again. She had, I think I mentioned it earlier, she had quite fragile health. She'd had rheumatic fever as a girl in Paris, and that had affected her right the way on through the rest of her life. And anyway, she was therefore flown by Lysander into France. She joined a circuit. It was to begin with, it was just a three-person circuit. It was called the Historian Circuit. The leader of it was George Wilkinson. It's a new circuit. It was principally to contact railwaymen. So there'd been contact before from other circuits and other leaders with railwaymen. This was around the Orléans, just south of Orléans region. And the idea was to organize these people, arm and train them so that when the invasion came, they could disrupt, in particular, the rail communications in the area. So the leader was George Wilkinson. That's a story in itself, one of three brothers. Two of them were in S section SOE, and none of the three brothers survived the war. The number two, or the arms trainer, was a chap from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the American equivalent to SOE and SIS, and that was Andre Studler. And Lillian was the radio operator for them. So that was a typical three-person SOE circuit.
Yeah. So how does she like? What's her experience in the field? You know, how does she end up getting captured? What,
Yeah.
etc.
She seems to have done everything right in that she moved around a lot. So when you were trained as a radio operator, you were told really not to try and not stay in the same property for longer than 48 hours because the Germans were so good at direction finding. And Lillian generally did that. She moved around a lot of different premises. So these were French resistance workers, very brave people in the villages in the countryside south and southwest of Orléans. Um, and she basically had couriers who came to and fro from her with messages from the leader, from George Wilkinson, or from Andre Studler to radio back to Britain and to arrange supply drops of arms and materiel. And that included at one point the reception of a fair chunk of SAS Operation Gain, who went into a reception by the historian circuit. So again, that would have been organised through Lillian's radio set. But she kept a very low profile, and it was very bad luck that she was caught as she was.
Yeah. So, and as you say, it was the radio operator was the most riskiest role in essence. So her probably odds of survival or avoiding capture were fairly low to begin with.
Yeah, and there's a famous statistic that at one stage of the war, again in that summer of 1943, if you went to France as a radio operator, the average period of time before you were caught was 6 weeks. It got better than that in 1944, and there's no evidence that Lillian was direction found by the Germans. And she just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when the Germans came looking for someone else. And there are several versions and several opinions as to how that came about. But it looks like they were certainly looking for somebody else. There are two other candidates that the Germans may have been looking for. And to begin with, they didn't find Lillian. She was asleep upstairs, but she'd been transmitting through the night and had fallen asleep, exhausted in the morning. And when the Germans went upstairs to check the rest of the property, having arrested the people downstairs, the French resistance people, they found Lillian asleep and her radio set there and her codes and messages and everything.
Blimey. That's, as you say, incredibly brave to have been in that situation, and it must have been constantly looking over your shoulder, waiting for a tap type thing. And unfortunately, she was captured. And so what was the experience like for her from that point? What do we know about her, the period after her capture?
Yeah, she was taken off to a local town and then up to Orléans and then transferred up to Paris. Actually, just before I leave the subject of how she transmitted, I would just say that it's a very strong feeling amongst the French of how loved she was in these different places. So the families that she stayed with thought a great deal of her.
Hmm.
So after capture, yeah, she ended up in Paris. There were two places she may have been. And one was the Avenue Foch, which was the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS counterintelligence unit's headquarters, and the other was the Rue des Saussayes, and that was the Gestapo headquarters. I would suspect that she had very little, if any, time there because as she was arrested at the end of July 1944. So as she got to Paris, it would have been as the Germans were evacuating Paris, and they themselves were leaving Paris, and they were transporting all um, their prisoners off to Germany. We know she was definitely at Fresnes prison on the outskirts of Paris, and that's where, as a threesome, she and Violette Sabot and Denise Bloch, all three S-section girls, were transported off to Germany together. We know that the first stop where they spent some days was a pretty horrific transit camp called Neue Bremen, and that was at Saarbrücken, just inside Germany. It was the only concentration camp run by the Gestapo rather than the SS. And as I say, it was a transit camp, so they weren't there too long, horrible conditions, but they were then sent on to Ravensbrück concentration camp, which was the women's camp north of Berlin.
And well, I guess just quickly touched upon because the two characters at this point have met up. You mentioned Violette and Lillian earlier. How did they kind of contrast in their approaches, their personalities?
Yeah, I think because of her continuing health issues throughout her life, Lillian was the least robust of the three. And Violette seems to have been quite a strong leader, really, among the three, with Lillian and Denise really playing what I would call subsidiary roles within that little threesome. There is some nice evidence that on the way to Germany, the train, which also included a big group of male SOE agents, it was attacked, ironically, by RAF fighter bombers, it seems. And during the confusion, there's evidence that the girls were able to crawl along the carriage and give water to the men. It was a very, very hot August that they were when they were being transported to Germany. So while her health was still adequate, she was fine. But as time went on and the conditions at Ravensbrück were not good at all, as the winter weather came on, that made things a lot worse. And then there were two work camps which the women were sent to. And I hope I've uncovered new elements of both those work camps. So for people who are interested in either Violette Savot or Denise Bloch, I think you'll find new elements within the book because I took time to look at the two camps. One was at Torgau and one was at Königsberg Neumarkt, and both have been confused with either other towns or other prisons in the past. But at Torgau, they worked at a munitions factory. So it wasn't a formal prison at all. There was a big formal prison in Torgau, but that wasn't where they were. And when they went to Königsberg, that wasn't the Königsberg on the Baltic coast. It was on the Oder River, and they were working on the extension of an airfield, a Luftwaffe airfield. And that airfield is still there today. It's largely disused, apart from a microlight every now and then. But that in itself has an interesting history. So I included that in the book as well.
Perfect. So I guess finally, sadly for her story and the others' stories, how does it end? What's their last days look like?
Very, very sad. They were on probably the worst work camp that they were on, which was the airfield at Königsberg Neumarkt. It was in the depths of winter. They weren't adequately clothed. Lillian's health had deteriorated to the extent that if she went out on parade, she collapsed and became unconscious. So she spent a lot of time in the sick bay of the infirmary. That sounds better than it was because it was simply a couple of nurses or a doctor from among the prisoners who could give aid. But she was spared a lot of the hard work as time went on because she was so ill. And the three of them were called back to Ravensbrück in late January or early February. So we don't have a definite date for when they met their tragic end, but they were called back. They There was mixed feelings about that. Some people thought they were being called back for an exchange with German prisoners through the Swedish Red Cross, and some people thought it was better that they were going back to Ravensbrück because there were better medical facilities there. There were better prisoner doctors who could help Lillian in particular. Denise wasn't well at all either, and Violette was still the only one with decent health, still suffering. The conditions were awful, and whether you subscribe to German torture or not, there are varying options and opinions on that. But the sheer conditions of the camps that they were in and the sort of work they were put to, that was torture.
Indeed. And I know obviously you mentioned, that not all details are clear as to what happened, but there are obviously some different kind of narratives as to the final moments for them.
Yeah, I think the balance of evidence is that when they got back to Ravensbrück, and there were other SOE S section women agents in Ravensbrück who managed to survive. So there's a bit of testimony from them. But I think the accepted position is that they were held after they came back in a semi-underground bunker of solitary confinement cells. And then the order arrived from Berlin that they were to be executed. They were taken out into the yard adjoining the crematorium, so it was outside the main camp wall, and they were made to kneel down one at a time and shot singly in the back of the head. And so I always think if you were the third person waiting for that, you saw it happen to your two friends, the two people you've been with all the
Mm.
time. And it was said that only at that stage, only Violette was well enough to walk to her execution, and Denise had to be helped, and Lillian was on a stretcher.
God, it's unimaginable, isn't it? I think the only mercy there is that it was fairly quick in its end in that sense, but from the single shots. But yeah, very brave women, all of them. So I guess on a kind of brighter note to that, how is Lillian remembered today? Obviously, not just through your publication now, but elsewhere.
Recognition's been growing, and it's in Britain, it's in France, particularly in Paris. It's in Brazil, even in the expats church that she used to go to in Rio de Janeiro. Um, and it's in Germany at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. But in Britain, yeah, we've included her from the Secret World War II Learning Network, of which I'm a trustee. We've included her on Information Board, where she went to Student Assessment Board outside Cranley in Surrey. And of course, some early recognition of Lillian came from the film about Violette Savot, which was in the 1950s. And the execution, which I've just described, is in that film and is quite a choker. It's a much more sanitized um, execution in the film. It's a firing squad. They're shot at the same time, etc. It was more sordid than that in real life. But she was known as Lillian, and Denise was known as Denise in the film. But it then dropped off after that. And the good thing is that recognition of Violette has continued. So to a little extent, Lillian is on the tailcoats of that. And as I say, it's a different character. Violette had two missions into France as well, so I think that's another reason why Violette is the heroine that she deserves to be. Um, but Lillian deserves her place in the sun as well.
Definitely. And through your research, obviously, she was on your radar beforehand, but through the research you did for the book, for writing the book, did your impression of Lillian change at all?
Um, I think I realised what a fragile character she was, and there were times in her training when she was quite emotional and broke down, etc. But by recognizing how fragile she was, both being a sensitive character and being fragile in her health, my admiration grew for her then in respect of her actually volunteering and doing so well in the field,
Mm.
not being detection found in the field, and gaining the respect of and the friendship of the French people that she stayed with. It's very easy to be blinded to all the positive elements if you're doing someone's biography. They become your hero or heroine. Um, so I've tried to be fairly even-handed in showing the not so robust elements of Lillian alongside what she actually achieved. So yeah, it changed a little bit on the way.
Definitely, and I think for those that haven't already got their copy, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at what Paul's achieved, and it's definitely going to be, I think, a defining work on Lillian. So as you mentioned, your retirement continues to be busy. Have you got any other kind of projects on the go at the moment that you're working on?
Um, yeah, a couple. I'm not sure I'm going to do too much more writing, but I like editing memoirs, and I've just done one which is just a booklet, but it's coming out through our charity, Secret World War II Learning Network, and that's the quite entertaining memoir of a chap called Major Edwards, who was the commandant at SOE's parachute training school in Cheshire, where Lillian spent a couple of days. Um, so that's that. I'm doing the Roll of Honor for French section SOE 104 agents. I'm looking to put that online rather than produce it as a book, so I can easily update it and add to it. And I've possibly going to do a reissued memoir to do with the Jedbras, part of SOE. So they're the things at the moment. But as I said earlier, I'm a reluctant author and writer, and it's the research and sharing the knowledge and the understanding of not just SOE, other elements when we can. We've done something recently for MI5, MI6. I'd love to do something if they could release all those files, but also MI9, SAS, anything like that.
Indeed, and I think most of the people were preaching to the converted in the live audience tonight. But I think for those watching this, if you found this subject interesting, it goes without saying, have a look at the Secret World War II Learning Network on where you can find the website through Google, etc., social media. Paul and I are both trustees for the record, so we wouldn't be able to not get a mention of those in, but it really does a lot to commemorate the likes of Lillian and her colleagues, and many of whom are sadly did not survive to tell the tale. So finally, we're going to close the recording shortly. Just a plug for your book. So if you'd like to purchase a copy, please have a look at barnformpublishing.co.uk. You can also find it on Amazon, of course. Paul also has some exclusive copies which are hardcover. So if you're interested in those, please have a chat with Paul. And there it is, arrived today in the nick of time.
Hard copy.
Yeah. Perfect. So yeah, thank you very much, Paul. An excellent talk, and we will switch the recording off and we will go to questions.